"We must all hang together," or "Assuredly, we shall all hang separately." Benjamin Franklin. Unfortunately, the independence of the Federal Reserve is not absolute. The freedom of action of the Open Market Committee is guaranteed by law and can be restricted by another law. Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Federal Reserve. The President, the Governor of Texas, and their wives were smiling and waving to the Americans greeting them. It was a sunny day, great weather, excellent visibility. The Lincoln Continental convertible provided a perfect view. Great shots were possible. That's why dozens of photographers and cameramen, many of them amateurs, were filming the slowly moving motorcade. In the back seats of the car were the presidential couple. In the forward-facing seats ahead of them were the governor and his wife. The mood was excellent. Dallas was festively decorated. Noise, welcoming cheers. That's why Jacqueline Kennedy didn't hear the dry, almost like the crack of an exhaust pipe, snap. Distracted by the crowd, she was waving and only, turning back into the car, saw that her husband's body was leaning onto her shoulder. The president's face contorted, and with his right hand he grabbed his neck, from which blood was pouring. "Oh my God, what have they done?" Jacqueline cried out in despair. "Oh my God, they've killed Jack! They've killed my husband! Jack! Jack!" An unknown man, standing in front of an advertising billboard, had just opened his umbrella. The sky was clear, the temperature around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, so it wasn't hot. Why did he open the umbrella? Why was he making various movements with it? At that moment, no one thought about it. Governor John Connally collapsed into his wife's arms, a bloodstain spreading across his clothes. He fell just in time. Another bullet literally shattered the U.S. president's head. Jacqueline Kennedy saw a piece of her husband's skull fly backward and land on the extended bumper of the Lincoln. Barely understanding what she was doing, the First Lady left her dying husband and rushed to the hood of the car to pick up the bloodied fragment of his skull. The mortally wounded president was rushed to the hospital, where he died 35 minutes after the assassination without regaining consciousness. November 22, 1963, 12:35 p.m., Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy's assassination. Perhaps the most famous and mysterious. Over 45 years have passed, and the question of who killed the 35th president remains unanswered. The official version states that John F. Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone assassin, using an Italian-made Mannlicher Carcano sniper rifle. The killer fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, where he worked. However, the number of mysteries in this story exceeds all conceivable limits, so most Americans don't believe the official version of their president's death. They have every reason to doubt. The weirdness started right after the tragedy. The cops who cordoned off the assassination scene immediately figured that the sniper had to have fired from the Texas School Book Depository. They found an open window, 3 shell casings, and a rifle registered to Lee Harvey Oswald, with his fingerprints on it, as it turned out. 40 minutes after Kennedy's death, the police already knew the name, appearance, and address of the suspected killer. Catching the crime of the century should have been easy. The guy didn't change his looks, didn't hide, nothing. But for some reason, even though they knew Oswald's home address, the cops didn't send anyone to check his apartment. Instead, they spotted him on the street. Dallas police officer J.D. Tippett, noticing someone matching the description, tried to stop him. Oswald pulled a gun and shot him dead. And there's another head-scratcher. Dallas police rules said there should have been 2 officers in the car, but Tippett was alone. Then the Texas theater, where Oswald had holed up, was surrounded by cops and he was arrested, without a single shot fired. Officially, his gun jammed. He was charged with Tippett's murder and, somehow, became the lone assassin of the president. But it's not that simple. There's a 26-second amateur film of the assassination shot by Abraham Zapruder, and it's been studied frame by frame ever since. According to the official story, 3 shots were fired. The first missed, the second hit Kennedy's neck and ricocheted into the governor's chest, wrist, and thigh, and the third struck Kennedy in the head. Here's the thing. The Zapruder film clearly shows Kennedy's body snapping backward on the second shot. But the book depository was behind the motorcade, which means a bullet from there should have pushed him forward. That's basic physics. Not even being the president cancels out the laws of physics. Analyzing the Zapruder film raises even more awkward questions. It turns out the killer supposedly fired all the shots in about 5 seconds. For that semi-automatic rifle with a telescopic scope, that's basically impossible, because after each shot, you have to cycle the bolt. The minimum time needed to fire 3 rounds is longer than what Oswald supposedly managed. They even brought in professional snipers to try it, and none of them could fire 3 accurate shots in 5 seconds like Oswald allegedly did. That kind of marksmanship would be worthy of the Guinness World Records. Shooting a moving target that fast and that accurately would be impressive for any seasoned shooter. But everyone who knew Oswald said that, despite his time in the Marines, he was a terrible shot. But what was the investigation supposed to do when there were 3 shell casings in the book depository? That strange discrepancy was just ignored. In fact, so were a lot of other things. We often hear about the curse of the pharaohs, where everyone involved in discovering King Tut's tomb supposedly died quickly and mysteriously. JFK didn't have a tomb, but anyone unlucky enough to get involved in his death ended up dying under pretty bizarre circumstances. One meticulous researcher calculated that the mathematical probability of this chain of deaths was 1 in 100,000 trillion. In other words, it couldn't have happened naturally. The first victim of the Kennedy curse was his so-called official assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Caught red-handed, he kept insisting he had nothing to do with it. "I didn't kill President Kennedy. I didn't kill anyone. I don't know what all this means," he said. By the way, he was never allowed to call a lawyer. He never confessed to killing Kennedy. Then, just 2 days after the president's death, while being transferred from one jail to another, Oswald was shot dead. His killer, Jack Rubenstein, better known as Jack Ruby, had no special access to the police department. He didn't need it. Think about that. A complete stranger from the street was allowed to get close to the man accused of killing the president, and then he shot him dead. Not just shot him, he killed him point blank, pressing a .38 revolver right into his ribs. And this happened at the very start of the investigation, in a country with strict rules for protecting witnesses or the accused themselves. It's impossible, unthinkable, yet it really happened. After the shooting, Lee Harvey Oswald was still alive. They rushed him straight to the jail office. Secret Service Chief Forrest Sorrells spotted a plainclothes officer kneeling beside the bleeding Oswald, trying to give him mouth-to-mouth. Sorrells didn't know who that man was. After a few tries, blood from Oswald's stomach burst out with such force that it made things worse. Moments later, Lee Harvey was gone. Maybe presidents just don't get killed in America? Maybe the mighty superpower, with all its political and economic strength, had zero real experience protecting high-profile figures or investigating their murders? Not quite. The history of the United States is full of tragic anniversaries. John Kennedy became the 4th U.S. president to fall to an assassin's bullet. Before him, it was Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and William McKinley. So America's security agencies were supposed to be on high alert. And if they couldn't save the president, at least keeping the suspect alive should have been a matter of honor. But one eerie twist followed another. Within just 2 years, 62 key witnesses, people who could have shed light on the case, died under strange circumstances. Here are just a few facts. Jack Hunter, a cop who visited Oswald's apartment right after the assassination, was shot dead at the police station. They said his gun went off by accident. Jim Cother, a reporter who had checked out Oswald's apartment with Hunter, was shot at home. The cab driver who drove Oswald from the book depository to his place on the day of the assassination died in a car crash a week later. Key witness Lee Bowers, who claimed he saw 2 men firing from behind the fence, was killed in a car accident. A prostitute named Rose Cherami, who had spent a night with a drunk CIA officer who told her Kennedy will be killed in 2 days, also died in a car crash. The driver who hit her was never found. The surgeon who performed the president's autopsy and filmed it was found dead in his home from a gunshot wound. Though he was left-handed, the gun was in his right hand. The film disappeared. Even Jack Ruby, the man who shot Oswald, didn't escape a grim fate. 4 months after Kennedy's death, on March 14, 1964, Ruby was sentenced to death but later won an appeal. In December 1967, while waiting for a new trial date, he was suddenly diagnosed with cancer. He died in the hospital on January 3, 1967. With Jack Ruby's death, the last real chance to untangle that web of suspicious coincidences was gone. The president's killer was dead, and so was the killer of the killer. And the miracles kept coming. Just before his death, Jack Ruby gave an hour-long, one-on-one interview to journalist Dorothy Kilgallen. But for some reason, Kilgallen never published it, even though it would have been a huge scoop. Not long after, she was found dead from a drug overdose, despite never having used drugs before. Nellie Connolly, the wife of the Texas governor, personally saw that the bullet which hit her husband in Kennedy's car came from a completely different direction. Her testimony was never even recorded. Investigators drew such a twisted flight path for this second bullet that the press nicknamed it the magic bullet. Think about it. After hitting the president's neck, that piece of lead supposedly bounced into the governor's chest, wrist, and thigh. 3 out of 4 eyewitnesses, police officers, locals, doctors, swore they heard more than 3 shots, and that the gunfire came from the front, not the rear. They said there were clearly multiple shooters firing from different angles. But investigators stubbornly stuck to the story of Oswald the lone gunman. On the films capturing the moment of the assassination, you can see the motorcycle escorts rushing not backward toward the book depository where Oswald supposedly fired from, but forward toward the bridge where they seemed to sense the real danger. Dr. Robert McClellan, the first physician to examine Kennedy's body, wrote, "The bullet entered the throat. The exit wound is in the back of the head." After a chat with the FBI, he said he'd been mistaken. Kennedy's brain, which had been kept for examination and could have shown the real bullet trajectories, mysteriously vanished. Just as mysteriously, the bullets that killed the president also disappeared. There was nothing left in the case file. According to the government's press office, the bullets had simply disintegrated inside the president's body. They said it with a straight face, as if Kennedy had been some kind of Terminator instead of a mortal man. On November 29, 1963, by order of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who had automatically become president, a special commission was established to investigate the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The commission, made up of 7 men, including 2 senators, 2 members of the House of Representatives, former CIA Director Allen Dulles, and banker John McCloy, was led by U.S. Chief Justice Earl Warren. It heard from 552 witnesses and reviewed over 3,000 reports from law enforcement and forensic agencies, which themselves conducted around 26,000 interviews. The witness testimonies alone filled 26 volumes. Yet the final report, which was supposed to shed light on the mysterious crime of the century, did little more than sharply criticize the CIA, FBI, and Dallas police for failing to protect the president, who, according to their conclusion, was killed by a lone madman, Lee Harvey Oswald, firing 3 shots from a Carcano rifle. But that wasn't the end of it. The bizarre conclusions, the mountain of ignored evidence, and the suspicious deaths of almost every key witness were too blatant to ignore. In 1979, the U.S. Congress formed a new special committee to reinvestigate the Kennedy assassination. Its verdict? Kennedy was killed as the result of a conspiracy. 3 years later, under pressure from the intelligence agencies, that conclusion was thrown out, declared incompetent, and officially void. In 1997, Gerald Ford, the last surviving member of the Warren Commission, admitted that the commission had deliberately falsified parts of Kennedy's autopsy report. Even the bullet's flight path had been adjusted. The CIA and FBI promised to finally declassify the Kennedy files in 2003. Apparently, until then, we weren't supposed to know the truth about who killed John Kennedy or why. That's what everyone says when talking about the Dallas tragedy and the strange chain of events that followed. But maybe we don't have to wait that long. Investigating a crime is about deduction. And deduction is logic. It's the hunt for suspects, for evidence, for motive. And in the Kennedy case, the main piece of evidence is the investigation itself. Its sloppy conclusions, its haste, its incompetence. This wasn't some forgotten old woman who got murdered in an alley. This was the president of the most powerful nation on earth. His own brother was the U.S. Attorney General, and even his authority wasn't enough to guarantee a full and honest investigation. What seems obvious to us now, even with a quick glance at the case, was clear to the Kennedy family right away. Something was wrong. You can feed any story you want to the general public, but Jacqueline Kennedy saw it with her own eyes. The bullet that shattered her husband's skull came from the front, not from behind, where, according to the official story, Oswald was supposed to be. The Kennedy family couldn't be fooled. It was Robert Kennedy's interference that the organizers of the president's murder truly feared. That's why they rushed to silence Lee Harvey Oswald just 2 days later, setting him up for a bullet. The president's brother never got the chance to step in, and to make sure he never could, the main suspect was sent to the afterlife with a little artificial respiration. What does that tell us? Only one thing. The people behind the president's death weren't just some gangsters or backroom conspirators. They held real power, massive power, inside the U.S. government itself. So much power that they could make the entire American law enforcement system work to cover up the crime, and make the Kennedy family quietly look the other way. Who could do something like that? The mob? Cuban exiles? Anyone could have pulled the trigger. But to make investigators ignore obvious facts, things anyone can still see in the footage and photos, that took something far bigger. Not even our own KGB could have pulled that off. And not the CIA or FBI either. Those agencies don't decide on their own who lives and who dies. Not even abroad, let alone on American soil. They're just the hands. There's always a head above them, and it's the head that gives the orders. Here's another important detail. Attorney General Robert Kennedy never dared to challenge the official investigation or the Warren Commission's conclusions. Why? Because he knew who killed his brother. And he understood that even the Attorney General couldn't do anything about it. "Forgive, but never forget," John Kennedy once said. His brother didn't forgive, and he certainly didn't forget. Robert Kennedy decided to become president himself. And that, by the way, is another reason why the U.S. primary system exists. It's a convenient way to block someone unwanted from reaching power. After what John Kennedy did, we'll get to that later, no one from that family was ever supposed to become president again. Robert tried anyway. He became a leading contender in the Democratic primaries, and when he actually won, he signed his own death warrant. On June 4, 1968, right after winning the California primary, the victory that effectively made him the Democratic nominee for president, Robert Kennedy was shot and killed at the Ambassador Hotel. His death was surrounded by no less mystery. In Los Angeles, after the killing of Robert Kennedy, with whom I had a good relationship, there was also an obvious effort to cover up the tracks of the crime. I can say this because I was present at the press conference in the hospital where Robert died. Only a few journalists were shown a document noting a powder burn on the back of Robert Kennedy's head. That kind of burn could only come from a point-blank shot. Sirhan Sirhan, the man the U.S. authorities named as Robert's killer, was shooting from the front, but the fatal shot came from behind. This key document was part of the murder case and was shown to the press for only 3 days. Then it disappeared entirely from the investigation files. Based on all this, I personally believe Robert Kennedy was shot by his bodyguard, who was standing behind him and fired at point-blank range, said Valentin Zorin, a well-known Soviet journalist of the time. Once again, we see something astonishing. When the U.S. government, for some reason, fakes the results of an investigation and hides the truth. That means you can't tell the truth about Robert Kennedy's murder, just like you can't tell the truth about John F. Kennedy's death. The death of the leader of such a powerful country is always a historic event, especially a violent one. Leaders all over the world haven't always died peacefully in their own beds. They've been killed in plane crashes, blown up, even shot at the dinner table. A violent death of a ruler is basically always a kind of coup, especially when the government that remains after the leader dies does everything it can to cover things up. So, what made John F. Kennedy a problem for the U.S. political elite? Was he planning to turn his country into some kind of developed socialist state? No. Kennedy was a devout Catholic, a true supporter of the American way of life, and he never had any plans to build communism. Maybe, like our Gorbachev, Kennedy quietly, under the cover of fancy words, was giving away the U.S.'s geopolitical positions around the world? Actually, it was during Kennedy's presidency that the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis happened, the event that almost sparked a military conflict between the U.S. and the USSR. And Kennedy showed serious backbone, forcing Khrushchev to back down and remove the missiles from Cuba. Keep in mind, this was just a year before his assassination. The crisis happened in October 1962. So he definitely wasn't weak or a pushover. Maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis was the only time Kennedy acted decisively, and the rest of the time he played it differently? No. It was under Kennedy that the U.S. actively tried to impose democratic order. More precisely, they tried it in Cuba and Vietnam. On the night of April 17, 1961, the CIA launched an invasion of Cuba. Units of Cuban exiles, trained in CIA camps and organized into what was called Brigade 2506, landed on the shores of the Bay of Pigs, at Playa Larga and Playa Girón. Along with small arms, they had about 10 Sherman tanks and 20 armored vehicles. By April 19, 1961, the fighting ended in total defeat for the Contras. In the lead T-34 tank attacking the Americans was Fidel Castro himself, a man who won the love of the Cuban people and built his enormous authority for a reason. Maybe Kennedy was against this kind of approach? No. He approved the invasion plan right after his inauguration in January 1961. And the American president didn't abandon the Cuban exiles who ended up prisoners of Castro's forces. They were ransomed for $62 million. But Kennedy didn't stop there. He kept fighting the enemies of his country, defending its interests to the very last possible moment. After the military intervention failed, they just switched tactics to remove the unwanted regime, now through economic and political sabotage. Operation Mongoose was set up to paralyze the Cuban economy. To disrupt the island's key industry, sugar production, they used harmful chemicals. About 400 CIA operatives were involved. The ultimate goal? Topple Castro. There were also fresh attempts to assassinate the Cuban revolutionary leader. The active anti-Castro campaign only came to an end with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the U.S. guaranteed that there would be no repeat of the invasion in exchange for the Soviet missiles being withdrawn. Interestingly, it wasn't just President Kennedy who handled all these behind-the-scenes details of American politics. His brother was deeply involved too. U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally oversaw Operation Mongoose. That means he was fully in the loop on the most secret activities of the intelligence services, and the CIA trusted him completely. During Kennedy's presidency, Americans didn't just arm the South Vietnamese army. They also took the first steps toward active involvement in the war. In December 1961, the first regular U.S. military units were sent to the country, 2 helicopter companies meant to boost the mobility of the government forces. The Advisory Corps kept growing. American advisors trained South Vietnamese soldiers and helped plan combat operations. So, we see that John F. Kennedy was, in a way, a typical American president, consistently defending his country's interests and fighting its enemies. The political elite shouldn't have had any complaints about him as a leader. But apparently, they did. Serious complaints. Because only those in power could have conducted the investigation into his assassination the way they did. So why were John Kennedy, and later Robert Kennedy, killed? After reading this chapter, you'll be able to answer that question yourself. But for now, dear listener, let's take a step back. Because this chapter isn't about one American president, it's about 2. And we're not going to tell their story in chronological order, but in a logical one. It's 1918. World War I has just ended. The war wiped out the world's biggest empires that had competed with the Anglo-Saxons and paved the way for a new empire, the empire of the paper dollar. But in 1918, that greenback, pardon the pun, was still pretty much golden. The dollar, the pound, and the franc all still had gold backing. The chains of the gold standard still tied the Federal Reserve and its owners, keeping them from printing endless amounts of unbacked cash and flooding the world with it. The kind of dizzying possibilities that money could offer depended entirely on how much gold was sitting in the vaults. To print as much money as you want, without ever actually doing it, you'd have to be truly saintly, or, at the very least, a convinced Bolshevik Marxist. But we know the Fed wasn't created, and isn't run today, by altruists or philanthropists. It's bankers and financiers. They were never saints, and they never will be. From the start, the creation of the Federal Reserve was a series of calculated moves toward global domination. Part of that path has already been walked, but there's still more ground to cover. Let's give the guys a mental round of applause. You've got to admit, they really knew what they were doing. Every move came with a justification, every bitter pill wrapped in a shiny package. Granted, it was the same wrapper every time. But how do you justify turning money into, well, completely paper? There's really only one way. The same reason the Federal Reserve came to life in the United States. Crisis. That's the favorite excuse for quietly reshaping the world's financial system unnoticed by most people. And if you want to rearrange the world itself, crisis is your best tool. Every crisis has multiple purposes. It's layered, like a pastry. And a war? That's just a really extreme kind of crisis, bloody and terrifying. You can safely say that every change, every step along the long path of the Fed's owners toward global domination has happened, happens now, and will continue to happen through artificially created crises, whether it's a stock market crash, a war, or a plunge in currency and securities. A prime example is the Great Depression in the U.S. in the first third of the 20th century. If you look closely, the parallels practically jump out at you. Every economic collapse follows an incredible boom, and the Great Depression was no exception. When President Calvin Coolidge stepped down in 1928, he said, "The country can look with satisfaction upon the present and with optimism to the future." And for a while, it seemed like he was right. America was booming. Why? Because the Federal Reserve had dramatically increased the money supply in circulation. And the higher the rise, the more catastrophic the fall that had been planned. A collapse unprecedented, not just in U.S. history, but in the history of the entire world. Why? The owners of the printing press were getting ready to buy up the United States for next to nothing. Not the whole country, of course, but basic self-preservation meant wiping out any serious financial structures they couldn't control. Why? So that no one in the U.S., even if they won an election, could just wave a pen and dismantle the Fed. So that no one could set up a new Fed owned by someone else. Only money and the immense power of finance multiplied by the media could put a politician in power. There could be no other financial force in the U.S. This was the first aspect of the Great Depression, the defensive one. But there was also an offensive side. During a total economic collapse, the richest pieces of industry could be bought up easily, and, more importantly, very cheaply. Again, the goal was to concentrate all financial power into a single set of hands. So, you might ask, was the power of the banking community ever really threatened? Why would they stir up trouble in their own country? This is a question often asked by people who don't fully understand the rules of political games and are unfamiliar with history. By 1920, J.P. Morgan ruled the American financial world with absolute authority. At 23 Wall Street, a grand building was erected to house the headquarters of his bank. That building still stands today. And even now, if you visit New York, you can see traces of what happened there 89 years ago. On the facade of the fortress-like building, you can still see the pockmarks from the explosion that rocked it in 1920, when, in the middle of a workday, a horse-drawn wagon loaded with dynamite and shrapnel blew up in front of the bank's headquarters. Dozens of people were killed or injured, and to this day, no one has been able to fully reconstruct what really happened. And that wasn't the only attempt on J.P. Morgan's power. On the eve of World War I, back when the Fed was still in its infancy, the U.S. Congress tried to break up Morgan's vast empire, clearly sensing the threat even then. By the beginning of 1914, he controlled over $20 billion. That's a mind-blowing amount for the time, though it would still look pretty impressive today. There are two ways to win any war. Either defeat your enemy on the battlefield, or make it impossible for them to keep fighting. Destroy the economic foundation. Take away the means to resist. The bankers, the owners of the Fed, could only be opposed by other money, someone else's money. And the tool for destroying that outside financial power? Crisis. All the wealth so quickly accumulated in previous years as paper assets vanished. The prosperity of millions of American families, built on a massive foundation of inflated credit, suddenly proved illusory. Powerful industrial enterprises were thrown off course and paralyzed. Following the stock market crash between 1929 and 1932 came a relentless fall in prices, which in turn caused production cuts and widespread unemployment. Winston Churchill described the Great Depression in the U.S. Just a few numbers to wrap your head around. During the Great Depression in the U.S., there were 15 million unemployed. Another equally solid source gives an even more shocking number, 17 million. Coal production in the U.S. dropped by 42%. Pig iron output fell 79%. Steel production was down 76%, and car manufacturing plummeted 80%. Out of 297 blast furnaces, only 46 were still running. And over the years of the crisis, a mind-blowing number of businesses went under. 135,747. 10,000 banks disappeared into nothing. These are facts. No economy in the world has ever faced a nightmare like this, not even in wartime. And yet, in 1929, the United States wasn't at war with anyone. And guarding financial stability was the Federal Reserve, created precisely for this purpose, to prevent crises. So, how did the disaster happen? Remember what Winston Churchill said? Credit has been expanded. And expanded it was. To trigger a financial crisis, the first step was to lend out as much money as possible. What do you need for that? Just two things: a lender and a borrower. To create a lender, the Federal Reserve quickly pumped up the money supply by almost 50%, from $31.7 billion in 1921 to $45.7 billion in 1929. Through the Fed system, this cash went to the right banks, which then loaned it out to other banks and organizations. A couple levels down, the money trickled out as loans into the pockets of ordinary people and small business owners. Borrowers were created by the media, which kept pushing Americans to take out loans to improve their lives. Sound familiar? Think 2005, 2006, 2007. Back then, to inflate the financial bubble, bankers in Russia were literally camping out in electronics stores, grabbing anyone who walked in. In the U.S., they were handing out mortgages to anyone who asked. Borrowing for lifestyle had started becoming a trend in the West long before the Great Depression. In the early 20th century, the U.S. tweaked its laws to make it easy for citizens to get rich fast. And the scam hasn't really changed since. It's basically the stock market game. Interest rates on loans were cut, and at the same time, people were encouraged to invest those loans in stocks. With these loans, called margin loans, you no longer had to pay the full 100% of a stock's value. You only needed 10%, and with that small amount, a new player could use credit to control the full 100% of the stocks. Even today, in any economy, lowering the entry barrier explodes the number of buyers. There are way more people with a tenth of the money than those who can afford the whole sum. Back in the 1920s, the crowd flooded the stock market just like people in Russia line up for TVs and fridges nowadays. Who covered the missing money? The stockbroker, who in turn borrowed from the bank. In the end, everyone wins, or so it seems. The broker gets more clients. The investor profits if the stock price rises just 10%. And the sheer number of buyers pushes the stock prices even higher. But in this tasty cheese, there was a tiny, almost invisible piece of mousetrap. The stockholder who put in just a tenth of a stock's value had to cover the rest within 24 hours if the broker demanded it. Yet nobody seemed worried. The stock prices were skyrocketing thanks to the flood of new investors. A rapid boom had begun. People were making fortunes on the stock market. To join the party, Americans took out loans to buy stocks. Back in 1923, The Dow Jones stood at 99. By September 3, 1929, it had hit a record high, 381.17, quadrupling in just 6 years. Anyone can get rich on the stock market, read the cover of a popular women's magazine. Ironically, it hit the stands just a day before the full crash. By 1932, the Dow had plummeted to 41. The market didn't recover to pre-crash levels until 39 years later. Only in 1954 did it surpass the September 3, 1929 mark. So, where does the terrifying specter of collapse appear amid all this euphoria? Well, when you're making money and lending it out, you can always just stop lending and call in the old debts. The mechanism of a financial crisis is actually pretty simple. Stop giving new money and demand repayment of the old. And that's how the Great Depression was made. The same pattern repeated itself in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Banks controlled by J.P. Morgan and his partners demanded repayment of loans, massively, all at once. So what could the stockbrokers do, the ones who had loaned investors 90% of their stock purchases using money they borrowed from the banks? They had no choice but to demand repayment from their clients within 24 hours. And what could ordinary Americans do, people who had never imagined this could happen? They couldn't scrape together the cash in a single day. The only option left was to sell their stocks. Now imagine, every single stockholder floods the market at the same time, all with one goal, to sell. And no one shows up to buy. At first, the crash on Wall Street started on October 24, 1929, Black Thursday. Was demand higher than supply? No, there was no demand at all, just supply. At first, a panic-stricken, desperate sell-off began. Everyone needed cash, and almost nobody wanted stocks. Here's an interesting detail. In every article about the Great Depression and the stock market crash, you'll read that all the stocks were sold for next to nothing. But you'll never read that they were bought for next to nothing. Who was buying all the stocks being sold? On that first day, investors sold about 13 million shares. But that was just the beginning. After Black Thursday came Black Friday, Black Monday, and Black Tuesday. About 30 million more shares were sold for pennies, literally cents. Millions, literally millions of investors were ruined. Losses totaled around $30 billion, the same amount the U.S. spent on World War I. The very people who orchestrated the crisis, knowing exactly when and how it would happen, had already offloaded the assets they didn't need. And now, with bankrupt investors falling out of windows as a grim backdrop, these few dozen people became the owners of almost everything. That's when the number of banks in America dropped from tens of thousands to just a few hundred. And most of them now belonged to the right people. No one had money anymore. So what did the Federal Reserve do? The very institution created to fight crises. I think you already know the answer. Instead of helping the economy with cash, the Fed did the exact opposite. The money supply, which had been carefully expanded before the crash, was slashed from $45.7 billion in July 1929 to $30 billion by July 1933. Now, things could move forward. The problem was created. It needed a solution. But for Americans to accept it, or more precisely, to come to terms with it, the problem had to be blown up to cosmic proportions. The stock market crash and falling share prices had to become a depression, capital D. And the tool for making things worse? That was the Federal Reserve. After the Wall Street crash, when everyone needed money and the U.S. economy looked like a person who had lost most of their blood, the Fed didn't pump money in. On the contrary, it cut the money supply by several times. The stock market crash turned into a crash of everything. People in fancy suits holding signs that read, "Will work for anything," became a staple of 1930s American life. So, what was the solution? A new leader, a new course. On March 4th, 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became President of the United States. In Russia, people view him positively. He's generally seen as a more reliable and cooperative ally to the USSR in the deadly fight against fascism, unlike Churchill. But this book isn't about World War II. It's about the crisis. Roosevelt pulled America out of the Depression. History textbooks mark the Depression from 1929-1933, tying the recovery of the U.S. economy to his arrival in the White House. Yet FDR was a bitter medicine for America. His rise to power had been prepared and orchestrated by the same powers who cooked up this terrible depression in the first place. But even dealing with the aftermath of the crash wasn't his main task. He had a truly monumental job ahead, the most complex and responsible task imaginable. Saving the United States from the deepening crisis? No. Roosevelt's main goal was to destroy the gold standard. That was the whole point of the Great Depression. The dollar had to be untethered from what had been considered eternal values. The dollar itself was supposed to become the world's main value and basically take gold's place. But as long as gold still held that role, the paper buck was always doomed to live in its shadow. What happened in the U.S. in 1933 would seem absolutely unbelievable, even to Russians who've been through plenty of rough times, from the Bolshevik grain requisitions to the 1998 default. Under the guise of anti-crisis measures, Roosevelt carried out radical changes. If you call them democratic in the modern sense of the word, the only person who might agree would be Valeria Novodvorskaya. Unemployed clerks who had never lifted anything heavier than a pen were handed shovels and sent to build highways and public buildings. Didn't want to dig or haul bauxite? Fine, no unemployment benefits for you. There was nowhere to go. Americans were basically working for their meals. Whenever you read about how smart and patriotic the first disabled president in American history was, that's how the story of the 30s usually gets told. Bold, fast, decisive. For example, in March 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps was created. A pretty name, but the reality wasn't so pretty. It was very reminiscent of the labor armies once dreamed up by Comrade Trotsky. But while in the USR, even seasoned Bolsheviks thought Lev Davidovich's idea was too ambitious and it remained just a concept, in the US, it was actually carried out. Unemployed young people were directed, or more accurately, sent, to remote regions of the country to conserve resources. The work was hard, and conserving resources meant more than planting trees or tidying up parks. It included clearing forests and building highways. By January 1934, 5 million people were involved. Pay? $1 a day. Yes, Roosevelt's reforms were bold and fast, but their speed was driven by one simple fact. The crisis had gotten so deep, it was threatening the very existence of the state. People were already starving to death in a country full of food. The goal of the bankers, the owners of the Federal Reserve, wasn't to destroy American industry or government outright. They just wanted to weaken them enough to assert control. Once they were weakened, it was time to bring them under control and then quickly rebuild the country's power. Here's the key point. Roosevelt's reforms didn't go against the wishes of the shadowy powers across the ocean. They were happening on their direct orders and with their blessing. Americans, busy with public works projects, barely noticed how quickly the country's financial system was changing. Almost as soon as he took office, Roosevelt announced the so-called bank holiday. All financial institutions were forcibly closed for a week. And it wasn't about calming depositors. It was to make sure no private citizen could pull out their savings. Because at the same time, the gold standard for the dollar was abolished. Then came Executive Order 6102, which stated, Section 2. By this order, all persons are required, by May 1933, to deliver all gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve Bank or its branches representing the Federal Reserve System. Section 9. Whoever willfully violates this presidential order, or any part of it, shall be subject to a fine of not more than $10,000, or, if an individual, may be imprisoned for not more than 10 years, or both punishments. The public was required to hand over all their gold to the Federal Reserve within 1 month. Private ownership of gold bars and coins, except for collectibles, was declared illegal. In exchange, Americans got paper dollars, which, from that moment on, replaced gold as a store of value. In Bolshevik Petrograd, people who refused to hand over gold or other currency were dragged off to the secret police. In democratic America of 1933, anyone refusing to surrender their accumulated precious metals faced a huge $10,000 fine. Remember, Americans were working for $1 a day, or 10 years in prison. The robbery of the American people went smoothly because the media presented it as a vital anti-crisis measure. The consolidation of the country's resources is necessary to get America out of the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt said. Under this cover, the president did exactly what he was elected to do. He took gold from the people. In one Hollywood action movie, the criminals planned to rob Fort Knox, the government's gold vault. That's exactly where all the gold collected by Roosevelt ended up, and it's still there today. Buying gold from citizens at $20.66 an ounce, Roosevelt immediately raised its value to $35 an ounce, declaring a devaluation of the national currency. The gold standard was gone, first in the United States, then everywhere else. After the Great Depression of the 1930s, the gold standard was abolished almost worldwide. This meant global trade was being set up for the day when the era of gold would be over. Americans could no longer exchange dollars for gold. The main goal had been achieved. Americans could now only save paper money, not gold bars or coins. So how do you save paper money most conveniently? Of course, by going to the bank, opening an account, and putting yourself in the hands of the bankers. Who created the Federal Reserve? Bankers. Suddenly, the entire huge country needed banks more than ever. Everyone now wanted only paper money, the kind printed by the Federal Reserve, which the bankers owned. And the paper they printed? It came right back to them. Gold? That usually sits in a vault, out of reach. That's the key difference. With paper money, a small group, the Fed's creators, gained control over the savings of every American, and, over time, control over the savings of the whole world. It's telling that as soon as gold was confiscated in the U.S., the crisis sharply declined. 1933 became the official end of the Great Depression, the year of the Great Gold Confiscation. It almost looks like the gold bars and coins in Americans' homes were the main cause of the country's economic troubles. And once that little problem was fixed, everything started working again. But the crisis left a completely different country than the one it had entered. The U.S. had already transformed. Money was now concentrated in the hands of a tiny group, more than anything humanity had ever seen. These same people controlled a huge chunk of industry and the media. On major factories, which made up only 5.2% of all American plants, 55% of all industrial workers were employed, producing 67.5% of the nation's industrial output. And the shares of these companies were owned by a few massive conglomerates. By the late 1930s, 1% of owners controlled 59% of the nation's wealth, while 87% of the population, most Americans, had just 8% of the wealth. Take John Morgan, for example. He was not just the founder and owner of banks. He also controlled industrial giants like U.S. Steel, General Electric, and several other corporations. This was the era when megacorporations and the brands we all know today were being born. We rarely stop to think about how Procter & Gamble ended up making not just laundry detergent, shampoos, and diapers, but also Pringles and a whole bunch of other stuff. The United States was fully conquered. The government was quietly and quickly absorbed by the banks. From that point on, only someone approved by the founding fathers of the Federal Reserve could become president. And by 1935, after the crisis, the Fed had taken the shape we know today. U.S. policy wasn't driven by the people's interests anymore. It was driven by the printing press. Then came World War II, millions more dead, and the dollar hitting new heights. After the Bretton Woods Agreement, it became the world's only reserve currency, and it's stayed that way ever since. And all of this was made possible by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who held office from 1933 to 1945 and died of natural causes. So, we have two presidents, two patriots, two talented figures. Each had their wins and their mistakes. Ordinary Americans loved both of them. And here's the kicker. Who loved them more? By the way, Roosevelt had way more reasons for the Americans he'd screwed over to hate him. Yet somehow, not a single Oswald showed up. Why? Because one lone enthusiast can't take down the leader of a country like that. The love or hate of the people doesn't matter here. Kennedy was hated by the political elite, and he was killed. Roosevelt? The same elite respected him for doing exactly what they wanted. So they re-elected him for a second term and let him die in office, just like a member of Brezhnev's Politburo. Now, let's figure out who Kennedy was really up against. To do that, we need to get a closer look at what the U.S. Federal Reserve really is. The Federal Reserve, the money printing machine. Who's bending the U.S. Constitution and why? To govern is to foresee. Empress Catherine II. To foresee is to govern. Pascal. It's hard to reason why a fridge breaks if you've never peeked inside its shiny white guts. You can't really understand why the TV that's been entertaining you for years suddenly went dark unless you know how it works and where the shows and movies actually come from. And it's just the same with financial crises. You can't make sense of them if you have no idea how the modern financial world really functions. The first question to ask is, what are money? Back in the early days of civilization, money was just the easiest way to organize trade between regions, countries, and even continents. You needed a common measure of value, a standard scale for worth, but it also had to be compact and durable. Early measures of value, cattle, animal skins, or salt, quickly gave way to money made from sturdier materials. There weren't many options. On some Pacific islands, they even used stone money, but it was tough to move around, so that system never really spread. In the end, metal, not stone, became the material for coins that could actually serve as a universal standard. No one knows exactly when money first appeared. Most historians agree that the first coins were minted in China and Lydia around the 7th century BCE. About 200 years later, Persian King Darius revolutionized his economy by introducing coins to replace the barter system. This gave the country a massive boost, and alongside his military victories, it was one of the main reasons the Persian Empire expanded so dramatically. Over time, the monetary system went through a bunch of surprising changes throughout history. For a long time, there was no standard choice of metal. It all depended on what resources a region had. In ancient Sparta, Aristotle tells us they used iron coins. There's evidence of lead and tin coins too. But over history, these metals were eventually replaced by three others. Small everyday coins were made from copper. Silver became the main currency, and gold was used for the highest value coins. Even minting coins didn't happen right away. At first, people just stamped metal bars to guarantee their weight and purity. After all, you can't carry scales everywhere to check how much precious metal you were handed. That's where the government stepped in as the guarantor, and it became the one to actually mint the coins. With so many states and coins of all kinds of weights and purities, the ancient world also gave rise to the first professional financiers, money changers, who handled exchanges for people. The copper-silver-gold system held the world's financial system together almost until the 20th century. Copper coins still exist today, a small change. But when historians talk about money back then, they usually mean a bimetallic system, where silver, alongside gold, served as a universal standard. By the early 1900s, though, countries started switching to a single metal system, the one we basically have today. Gold became the only universal standard, and national currencies were tied to it. Germany did it in 1871, the Netherlands in 1877, Australia in 1892, Japan in 1897, Russia in 1898, and the US in 1900. The big thing about metal money was simple. To make cash, you needed actual precious metal. Governments had to live within their means. They had no choice. On top of that, coins wore down, got lost, or sank in rivers and seas. To replace that lost metal required back-breaking work in silver mines and gold fields. Medieval states often struggled to grow industry and trade, sometimes just because they didn't have enough minted coins. There simply wasn't enough gold and silver to fuel the economy. That partly explains the rise of alchemy, with its attempts to turn base metals into gold through chemistry or magic. The real game changer came when Spain conquered new overseas territories. Gold from the Incas and Aztecs poured into Europe, setting the stage for the Renaissance and industrial growth. After the Spanish hidalgos, the Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch all rushed to explore and exploit the newly opened lands. The next stage in the history of money was the arrival of paper money. Unlike what many people think, issuing money on paper wasn't inherently evil. At first, there was no talk of printing unbacked, non-metallic currency. The first paper money appeared a long time ago, around the 7th or 8th century in China. Marco Polo, who visited, wrote with a sharp edge that while European alchemists were trying to turn metals into gold, Chinese emperors had figured out how to turn ordinary paper into gold. And he wasn't exaggerating. By the 13th century, paper money was already widely used in China. These notes were rectangular, carefully marked with special symbols and stamps, and made with impressive craftsmanship. They came in different values, and under penalty of death, people were required to accept them. But there was a carrot as well as a stick. Any holder of a note could exchange it for gold at any time. By the early 20th century, all the major world currencies, though long in paper form, were backed by gold. That meant a country's gold reserves matched the amount of paper bills its treasury had issued, and any holder could exchange a note for a set amount of gold at any time. But really, who needs gold in daily life? Just knowing you could get it if necessary was enough. The government guaranteed that, and both the US dollar and the Russian ruble were fully gold-backed. In a capitalist global economy, a very socialist principle held firm. Everyone lived according to what they produced. Countries didn't have unearned income, not backed by gold. That system lasted until 1913, when the United States made a bold, truly epoch-making move. Actually, bankers had known about it for a long time. If you could issue paper money without being tied to gold, wealth could become limitless. And limitless wealth always goes hand in hand with limitless power. To get rich, you need power. To hold and seize power, you need money. To achieve global wealth, you need global power. To keep power over the world, you need an endless source of money. It was a dizzying idea, but you had to start somewhere. Step 1, take control of money issuance in a major world power. Step 2. Remove from the political map any other powers that might challenge the right of one country to issue unbacked money. Now, line up two dates. 1. December 1913, the U.S. establishes the Federal Reserve System, the first private outfit in human history granted the right to print money. 2. August 1914, World War I begins. The result? 4 of the world's largest monarchies disappeared. Britain and France were left in dire economic straits, and the global economy went through a crisis like never before. Coincidence? No, it wasn't a coincidence. The process of creating the Federal Reserve in the U.S. is pretty fascinating and worth a closer look. In monarchies, minting coins was always a job for the state treasury. Different countries called it different things, but it was always government-run. In democratic America, though, the main law is the Constitution. Let's open it up and see what it says. The Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate its value, and the value of foreign coins. Right. In the U.S. Republic, power belongs to the people, and Congress represents them. That means Congress alone had the authority to mint money. And that's how it was until December 1913, when the People's Representatives passed the landmark Federal Reserve Act, or the Act of December 23, 1913. From that moment on, coins in America weren't minted by the government. They were minted by a private outfit. And don't let the word federal in its name fool you. It's just a bit of PR. There's about as much federal authority in the Federal Reserve as there is in Federal Express. Pick up a dollar and take a look. Right at the top it says Federal Reserve Note. That literally means Federal Reserve Banknote. Get it? You're not holding a US dollar. You're holding a Federal Reserve dollar. The words the United States of America down below, that's just geography. It tells you where the organization that issued the note is located. It doesn't mean you're holding official U.S. government money. In fact, before the Fed was created, actual U.S. dollars said just that. United States Note. These first appeared during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And that's when Americans came up with the famous slang names for money: greens, bucks, and the green stuff. Why? Because the dollar was green, especially on the back, where there's almost nothing in black print and no portrait of a statesman. That's how paper dollars got the nickname greenbacks, literally greenbacks. So what is the Federal Reserve? It's a private bank owned by other private banks. And it prints money that, out of habit, we still call US dollars. There used to be United States Note printed on American currency, but that disappeared. And since the dollar stayed green, hardly anyone noticed the change. Today, we're holding a little piece of green paper with some colorful designs. And most of us don't even realize it has nothing to do with the United States. If you check a reference book, you'll probably read a different explanation of the Fed. An independent financial institution created to serve as the central bank and exercise centralized control over the U.S. commercial banking system. Even in this dry description, there's truth. But no one really thinks about it. People just take it at face value, out of habit. Let's pause and think. Independent means non-governmental, right? So this private entity controls the U.S. financial system. Who created the Fed? 12 Federal Reserve Banks. And who created those Federal Reserve Banks? The government? Nope. There are no government banks in the U.S. They're all private. The founders of the Federal Reserve Banks were ordinary commercial banks, grouped by region. So who does the Fed control? The commercial banks? Exactly. But wait, weren't the Fed and its banks created by those same commercial banks? That means the Federal Reserve controls itself. Maybe we're wrong. Let's check. Grab an American phone book, the Yellow Pages. You'll find the Fed and its Federal Reserve Banks listed. Not in the blue pages where government offices are printed, but in the white pages for private companies, right there next to Federal Express. But who in America or abroad really notices that? Who actually calls the Fed? Who shows up at those addresses? Most people don't catch this global trick, not even our fellow citizens. After all, in news reports, the U.S. Treasury Secretary is always listed alongside the Fed chair, and they talk together about the most important issues. Today, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke and Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson will speak before the U.S. Congress Financial Committee, reports Rosfencom. The upcoming joint appearances of Fed Chair Ben Bernanke at the Economic Policy Committee and U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson in China have created very optimistic expectations for the dollar. When ordinary people watch TV, read newspapers, or browse the internet, they can't spot the trick. Everything looks proper and official. It gives the perfect illusion that these two are equal government officials. But the surprises don't stop there. Not only is the Federal Reserve far from being federal, it's not even really a reserve. The Fed has no reserves. No gold, no foreign currency, no silver. Nothing. Just offices, secretaries, and computers. Yet the Fed has the most important thing, the exclusive right to print dollars. If you have a money printing machine, you don't need any assets. You can print the money and get whatever you want. That's the Fed. And it also acts as the watchdog. It's the prosecutor, the judge, and the lawyer, all at once. Convenient, right? So a private entity is controlling the U.S. financial system, a country that dominates the world. Which means the Fed isn't just controlling the U.S., it's essentially influencing the financial life of the entire planet. But is the Fed really completely separate from the government? Yes, like the church in Soviet Russia. If you pick up a book written by Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, that's exactly what you'll read. The Federal Reserve System, formally independent from the White House. The secret is, the Fed isn't just formally independent, it's also informally independent from the U.S. government. Yet the appearance of propriety is carefully maintained, and it's easy to see how. Just look at how the Fed's leadership rotation works. On the surface, it all looks proper. The 7-member Board of Governors is appointed by the U.S. President and confirmed by Congress. Sounds official, right? But there's the catch. It's only surface deep. The President can approve the 7 members, but has no authority to give the Fed orders or remove any of the governors. By law, the Federal Reserve is independent. Not long ago, after Barack Obama won the election, I was listening to the hosts of a morning show on the main liberal station in our country. They were discussing serious topics, but their understanding was at a first-grader level. There was even less comprehension, but tons of arrogance, self-importance, and, sadly, an excess of hatred toward their own country. Anyway, talking about the new White House team, they seriously suggested that the new president might replace the Fed chair. And they concluded that Obama wouldn't replace Ben Bernanke. You don't change horses in the middle of a crisis. But the logic of the U.S. political system should lead to the opposite. Elections happen every 4 years, regardless of the state of the economy. If, in the middle of a financial crisis, you're not supposed to replace the people responsible for the economy, that is, the very crisis itself, then why hold elections at all? Following the logic of our experts, we'd have postponed the vote, let George Bush fix the economy, and then, 5 years later, finally hold an election. Of course, that's not how it works. The U.S. Constitution says elections are every 4 years. November 4th comes, elections happen, period. Elections happen, a new president takes office, and the entire team running the country changes. Not just the vice president and the secretary of state, about 5,000 people in government service get replaced. New faces come in at the top, the middle, and even the 10th tier. The only person who doesn't change? The Fed chair. Why? Because the U.S. president cannot appoint or remove them. Sure, the appointment is formally signed by the president, but the real decision is made somewhere else. Our journalists don't know this, so they make unnecessary guesses. If the president could replace the Fed chair, he absolutely would. Otherwise, it's absurd. A new Democratic team takes over every key post, but the most important financial position is still held by the same person who served the Republicans faithfully just a short while ago. This was exactly the course Barack Obama opposed, and that's why he won votes. It's easy to see this in action. Look at the career of the previous Fed chair, Alan Greenspan. This respected gentleman ran the Fed for a full 19 years, from 1987 to 2006. How was that possible? Greenspan was chosen by the Fed's Board of Governors, who themselves are appointed by the president, for a 14-year term. Meanwhile, a U.S. presidential term is just 4 years. Ask yourself, how can someone elected for 4 years possibly control someone elected for 14? The answer? They can't. In practice, Greenspan himself writes, their position is little different from a lifetime appointment. The Fed's structure is extremely complicated, and that's no accident. It's designed so that the average person just shrugs and doesn't dig deeper. The people who choose the Fed's governors are appointed for 14 years. The Fed chair, however, is appointed, just like the U.S. president, for 4 years. Sounds logical, right? The president leaves office, takes their whole team with them, including the Fed chair. But in practice, it works differently. Alan Greenspan ran the Fed for 19 years straight. Was it because the ruling party never changed? No, parties changed. Greenspan led the Fed under Republican President Ronald Reagan, Republican President George H.W. Bush, Democratic President Bill Clinton, Republican President George W. Bush. Each new president reappointed him to the top financial post in the U.S., and this went on until Greenspan himself retired. Personality quirks? Not really. We've seen the same pattern before. In 1979, Democratic President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as Fed chair. It later turned out, they write, that before Volcker's appointment, Carter didn't even know he existed. The candidate was suggested by David Rockefeller and Wall Street banker Robert Rausa, who convinced the president that Volcker was the one who could calm the financial world. Jimmy Carter was being super sweet, shuffling things around in his government, and on the advice of friends, he appoints someone to a key position, not someone he knows well, not even someone he knows at all. Then Ronald Reagan becomes president. He's a Republican. Carter's team steps down. Everyone leaves, except Paul Volcker, who keeps on working. Maybe it's because he's nonpartisan and that lets him stick around when the party in charge changes? Nope, Volcker is a Democrat. But Reagan, a Republican, doesn't replace him. In fact, he puts Paul Volcker back in charge of the Federal Reserve in 1983, 4 years after Carter first appointed him. Volcker will stay at the Fed until 1987, when Alan Greenspan takes over this super important job. But here's the really interesting part. On November 26, 2008, Barack Obama proposed creating the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. This advisory panel would be made up of non-government experts. And guess who Obama suggested as chairman? Former Fed chair Paul Volcker. Boom! Who else is expecting sweeping changes from Barack Obama? The Federal Reserve's decisions can't be overturned by the U.S. government or anyone else. Not the Treasury, not any other government agency. The Federal Reserve prints the dollars, or more accurately, lends them to the United States government. The Fed lends money to the government using government-issued bonds as collateral. Then, after collecting taxes from businesses and citizens, the U.S. pays back the Fed with interest, because those government bonds promise their holders a return. Here's a curious thing. Everyone knows that the United States issues bonds. But no one asks, why doesn't the same government just make money for the same amount? This oddity was even noticed by the inventor of electricity, Thomas Edison, who said, "It would be absurd to claim that our country can issue $30 million in bonds, but is unable to print $30 million in banknotes. Both are financial obligations, yet one benefits the moneylenders while the other helps the people." You can't speculate with money. It has no market price. But bonds? Absolutely. The price of bonds, stocks, and all other financial securities constantly changes, unlike the value of money. That's why the U.S. financial system, and the global system too, often feels like a madhouse. The Fed is the biggest creditor of the U.S. government, and in this world, the borrower always dances to the tune of the lender. Strange? You'll see why it's not so strange once you understand that the U.S. president rules mostly on paper. Real power doesn't belong to him. That's why the Fed chair gets a 14-year term. And no matter which party controls Washington, only natural causes can stop them from serving it fully. Don't believe me? Check for yourself. When in U.S. history has a Fed chair ever been replaced by a newly elected president? The story of the Federal Reserve's creation reads like a detective novel. Why on earth would the U.S. government, which had been successfully issuing dollars for nearly 150 years, suddenly give that up? The dollar was always a strong currency, not talking about the quality of the printing, but its purchasing power. Think about Mark Twain or Jack London novels. Back then, $100 was a fortune. Until the 20th century, the franc, the mark, and the pound sterling were all solid and valuable. Yet on the eve of World War I, $1 was worth 2 full Russian rubles. That shows Washington could handle this complex task, and do it well. You could say they learned on the go. Before the U.S. had its own money, Spanish, English, and French coins circulated here. In 1785, Congress passed a resolution making the dollar the official unit of currency. By 1792, the Philadelphia Mint was established, and in 1793, the first American dollars appeared. So why hand over the money-printing power to a private company? Ask yourself that. For 121 years, the U.S. authorities handled their financial marriage obligations just fine. And then, suddenly, they gave this crucial right to someone else. Why? If the government can't mint its own money, what can it do at all? We were ordered to forget our last names and not to dine together on the eve of our departure. We were to arrive at the appointed time at the railroad station on the New Jersey side of the Hudson, traveling alone and as inconspicuously as possible. A private car belonging to Senator Aldrich, attached to the last train car heading south, was to meet us at the station. When I approached the car, the curtains were drawn, and only faint yellow light revealed the shape of the windows. Once inside, we followed the agreed-upon rule to avoid using our last names, addressing each other only by our first names, Ben, Paul, Nelson, and Abe. We decided to take the secrecy even further and gave up using our first names as well. What was this? A secret meeting of undercover spies? A gathering of top mafia bosses? No, these are the words one participant used to describe the secret session where the final decision to create the Federal Reserve System was made. It happened in 1910 on the tiny Jekyll Island in the Atlantic Ocean. Following all the rules of secrecy, the bankers traveled to the island hiding their names. Once they arrived, the disguise only intensified. For a week or 10 days, we were completely cut off from the outside world. No phones, no telegraph. We hid out on a deserted island. There were lots of servants, but they had no idea who Ben, Paul, or Nelson were, let alone Vanderlip, Davison, or Andrew. None of those names meant anything to them. Like thieves under the cover of night, the bankers sneaked onto the remote island using code names and disguises. In one of the hotel's conference rooms, today known as the Jekyll Island Club Hotel, they drew up and, according to Frank Vanderlip, even wrote the report Senator Aldrich would present to Congress. Nelson Aldrich himself proposed creating a private central bank in the United States called the Federal Reserve System. But every action needs a pretext. Changing the country's financial system required one too, a financial one. The excuse was framed as noble. The U.S. Senate was told the nation needed an institution that could professionally fight financial instability. Naturally, the first step was to create that very instability, and that's exactly what they did. No bank in the world could survive a situation where all its depositors suddenly demand their money back at once. And if its peers refuse to lend it money or even demand that the bank immediately repay its existing debts, collapse is inevitable. That's basically how the crisis known as the Panic of 1907 was orchestrated. Look closely and you'll see all the familiar patterns of future crises. They all look alike, not because they're caused by the same economic problem, but because they're engineered the same way. The target was the investment bank Knickerbocker Trust, the third largest player on the market. Suddenly, rumors of serious trouble at the bank spread, and depositors rushed to withdraw their funds. Knickerbocker's management turned to the leading banker of the day, John Pierpont, J.P., but he refused to help, even though he was friends with the struggling bank's owner. Morgan's refusal fueled the panic. The peak came on October 22, 1907. From the bank's opening until noon, depositors withdrew about $8 million, roughly $50 million in today's money. By midday, Knickerbocker Trust had shut down and stopped all payments. Depositors of other financial institutions rushed to protect their money. On October 23rd, panic hit the Trust Company of America, the country's second largest trust. $13 million out of $60 million in assets was withdrawn in a single day. By October 24, 1907, the crisis had spread to the New York Stock Exchange. Banks started closing and going bankrupt one after another. 7 failed just that day, along with brokerage firms and trusts, not only in New York, but across the country. And then the savior appeared, J.P. Morgan. He saved the American economy while being one of the main architects of the crisis. Morgan refused to fix problems when they first appeared, let them grow, and then decisively stepped in to eliminate them quickly. Together with other bankers, he poured about $25 million into the U.S. financial market, stabilizing the situation. It's important to understand, any financial crisis is basically just a shortage of money. When the money comes, the crisis ends. It's easiest to put out a fire if you're the one who started it. Someone who's hidden something in a dark room will find it faster than anyone else. Banks started issuing certificates, substitute money, to increase the money supply. Morgan himself guaranteed the placement of New York City bonds, saving the city from bankruptcy. His authority was enormous. It was well known that his word was more reliable than any paper. J.P., the savior of the nation, didn't forget practical matters either. Under the pretext of rescuing it from collapse, he bought the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, whose looming bankruptcy threatened many brokerage firms holding its stock. And even though President Roosevelt opposed monopolies, he looked the other way for this acquisition. The aftermath of the Panic of 1907 hit the economy hard. The stock market fell 37%. At least 25 banks and 17 trusts went bankrupt. Commodity prices dropped 21%. Industrial production fell 11% over the year, and unemployment rose from 2.8% to 8%. Many organizations suffered losses. But Morgan came out of the crisis ahead. Knowing in advance about the collapse he had orchestrated, he sold shares at high prices, bought them back cheap, picked up stock in other key companies, and made a profit. His biggest gain, though, was the public trust he earned. Everyone believed the crisis hadn't become full-scale only because of Morgan's intervention. By June 1908, the economy was climbing again. At Princeton University, the new U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, praised the hero banker. All our problems could have been avoided if we had appointed a special committee of 6 or 7 statesmen like J.P. Morgan to solve our country's problems. And words were followed by action. To figure out the causes of the sudden crisis, the National Monetary Commission was created. Its job was to study the banking system and make recommendations to Congress. Naturally, most of the commission's members were friends and colleagues of Morgan, the savior. Senator Nelson Aldrich was appointed chairman. The commission got to work. It's no surprise that their main conclusion was a realization of the need to create a structure to regulate the financial system and prevent future crises. That led to the secret bankers meeting on Jekyll Island, where they decided the time had come to create the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was presented as a cure-all for every financial problem. This new institution's only job was to keep an eye on commercial banks, making sure they didn't get carried away on the stock market. And to do that effectively, the regulator had to be independent. In December 1913, the Federal Reserve Bill, pushed by Nelson Aldrich, came before the U.S. Senate. Without going into the tedious details of the vote, it's worth noting that only one senator opposed it. Senator Gilbert M. Hitchcock, whose terrible last name aside, agreed that a financial regulator was needed, but surprisingly proposed amendments that would have stripped the bill of its real power for bankers. He suggested making the Federal Reserve a government monopoly instead of a private system, with the Treasury regaining the right to issue currency. For reasons unknown to us, Hitchcock's amendments were rejected, and the bill was quickly passed. The president signed it later that same year, 1913, just in the last week before Christmas. Senators rushing to get to turkey dinners and decorated trees didn't bother much with understanding financial truths. Those who did grasp the historic upheaval the Federal Reserve Act represented convinced their colleagues that the decision was right. And bankers? They were over the moon. Overall, this is an excellent bill, and it will do much to bring banking and currency into a stable condition, said Edmund D. Guibert, Vice President of the Merchants Loan and Trust Company. It will bring about a flexible currency that will free us from these panics, echoed V.M. Gabblestone, President of the First National Bank of Richmond, agreeing with his colleague. Passing this financial law will have a positive impact on the entire country and will boost trade. It looks like the era of universal economic prosperity is beginning, said Oliver J. Sands, president of the American National Bank, beaming with optimism. Remember Khrushchev's words about how, by 1980, the Soviet people would be living under communism? They sounded impressive. But in reality, nobody in the USSR was actually planning to build real communism. In the same way, the grand words bankers used to promote the creation of the Federal Reserve had nothing to do with reality. The Fed wasn't set up to prevent future financial crises. On the contrary, it was designed to create them at just the right moment. Once, America was conquered by Europeans thanks to firearms and steel armor, which could pierce nothing but the spears and arrows of the Native Americans. In a similar way, at the start of the 20th century, bankers gained a tool that let them assert control over this blessed land. By controlling the issuance of the dollar, the secret owners of the Federal Reserve's printing press could pick and replace presidents and completely manipulate U.S. politics. The best way to hide something is to put it right in plain sight. All the information about the Fed is completely accessible. You don't need any conspiracy materials. Just visit the Federal Reserve's official website, and it's all laid out in plain English, federalreserve.gov. You can also check out the Fed's educational site here, federalreserve-education.org. Go there. Find the link on the left that says History and click it. You'll see the story of how this little bank was created, and even portraits of its key players, J.P. Morgan and Nelson Aldrich. Then, click the button labeled Structure, and you'll be offered a Structure Tour, a short virtual trip through the Federal Reserve. A voice from the speakers, repeating what's on the screen, sounds like a Hollywood sci-fi narrator and begins telling the story. Watch and listen. It's hard to believe the Fed really exists. Hard to imagine that the world actually works this way. But it's true. You just need to know how to read, observe, and think. Pay special attention to the second line of the tour. The Fed is a mixture of public and private elements. Even the Federal Reserve itself doesn't claim to be a government institution. Of course, its true nature isn't revealed. Just a mixture, that's all. And what percentage is private versus public? Nowhere to be found. It's all simple and obvious, despite the confusing structure. Long before the Federal Reserve was even created, the ancient poet Virgil said the same thing. Oh, what will you not drive greedy human souls to, cursed thirst for gold? Nothing has changed since then. Now, let's take a little detour. Talking about the high matters and financial peaks of our planet is tricky. They're distant, hard to understand, and often feel like the plot of a cheap detective novel. But some things are simple, familiar, and known to everyone, like the green American dollar. At the start of this chapter, we looked at it closely and realized that things aren't exactly as they seem. The US dollar doesn't actually belong to the US. But the surprises don't stop there. You're about to see why. Which dollar bills do you know? Usually people say $1, $5, $10, $20, $50, $100. That's right. A few more advanced collectors might add the rare $2 bill, which is considered a numismatic curiosity and, if it lands in the hands of someone who knows its value, is usually pulled out of circulation immediately. But what other dollar bills do you know? Very few can answer that. It turns out there's a whole range of bills most people don't even know exist. $500, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, and $100,000 bills. Almost nobody knows them for one simple reason. They're banned from leaving the U.S. under the country's currency laws. The $100,000 bill, a 1934 gold certificate, was never in regular circulation and was only used for transfers between Federal Reserve banks. Almost no one has ever seen one. And do you know who, or rather, whose portrait is on the largest dollar bill? Who's featured on the $100,000 note? This one's not too hard if you remember. U.S. money isn't printed by the government. The Federal Reserve has its own heroes, its own value system, and its own favorites in the dark corners of American history. On the $100,000 bill, the highest denomination ever issued, you'll find the 28th U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson. The very same president who signed the Federal Reserve Act and created the Fed. According to the Federal Reserve's printing press, he's considered one of the greatest figures in American history. And not just American history. Since Woodrow Wilson is on the bill with the highest value in history, he's effectively the most humane person of all time. Once you start looking into these family portraits, you make some really interesting discoveries. So, why did the U.S. elite turn against John Kennedy? On June 4, 1963, he signed Presidential Executive Order 11110. Under this order, Kennedy gave the U.S. Treasury the right to issue dollar bills backed by the silver held in the Treasury. As a result, $2 and $5 bills were printed with the inscription United States Note instead of Federal Reserve Note. With his executive order, Kennedy quietly started taking the Fed out of the money printing business, returning the printing press to the hands of the U.S. government. He was correcting a constitutional violation and the absurdity of a situation where the government couldn't even print its own money. It was a quiet, almost invisible government coup, a real act of betrayal. And it was exactly what the bankers, the founders of the Federal Reserve, feared most. To prevent it, they bought up the media, banks, factories, and corporations. And then, with just a single stroke of a pen, it was over. Kennedy had cracked the egg and picked up a needle with the death of Cochet in his hand. It was unbearable. There could be no delay. Because once small denomination bills were issued by the Treasury, it would lead to the Fed being completely cut off from printing money. Of course, this had to happen under a respectable pretext. What was the Fed supposed to do anyway? Regulate the financial market? Make sure there were no crises? Fine, let them regulate and watch. But they shouldn't be printing money. Less than 5 months after signing the deadly order for the Federal Reserve, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. For some, a patriot. For others, a traitor. So, who killed President Kennedy? I hope the answer is becoming clear. According to most researchers, the man with the umbrella, who opened it at the moment Kennedy was shot, was the conductor of the rifle orchestra, a spotter for the snipers. Standing next to the president's car, he was showing them what adjustment to make in their sights. The investigation never looked for this man.